morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com and also 92.1 at WFOV, the great radio station that is on University Drive, and they belong over there with the scholars, doing some excellent programs over there. And I am so elated to be partnering with that radio station. Is making a lot of noise out here in the community and doing a lot of great things in terms of bringing some great programming to the city of Flint. I was saying before that I wish they'd had higher voltage when they started, because that program does not have a lot of voltage strength, but it should be a national program, national programming, because of the kinds of things they're doing. But we're here and we are going to continue to grow, and we're going to be growing together here at allpointstv.com. And we'll do the best we can while we have the voltage that we have. I want to come to the studio. We're taping a little bit later than we normally do. We normally tape from 2 to 3 on Monday. We're taping today on Friday, and it'll be aired tomorrow on WFOV, and that'll be at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. I think I'll be a guest on the earlier program tomorrow at 11 o'clock. The one that's called Whose Opinion Is It Anyway, that is aired by Candace and Victor, and they're doing a great job over there, and I see them a lot in terms of when I'm doing programs at another radio station here in the city. I have a lot of respect for them and the job that they're doing. Their program, by the way, should be nationalized because they are doing some good programming with their shows. Let me come to the studio today to talk about, maybe I'll start off talking about the topic that we had this past Wednesday. I was on a radio show, and I was making the point that we have not had a civil war in this country, and there's been no war over slavery in the country. And one of the guests said that I was making a fool out of myself by making those kinds of statements. Outrageous was the way it was described, in terms of me having made these comments, because a popular view, of course, is that we had a civil war that was fought between 1861 and 1865, and here comes this historian upstart that does not have the credentials of some of the ones that's written all of these books. Every last one of them parroting the one that went before it, and talking about Lincoln as a great emancipator, and those persons that have made Lincoln the greatest president this country has had, and they hoodwinked the American people into believing that nonsense. A man that is responsible for the death of 600,000 to 700,000 Americans, the greatest president we've had. You can forget that. And I was sitting there listening to this noise about I'm the one that's off, but I'm going to try to lay out a case here, at least during the first part of the program. But I want to say this too, as far as the premise that politicians are great and we've had great presidents. I don't know where we get this idea from, that politicians are great. Great politicians. How can non-producers be great? And how can those who don't produce anything make a society great? Somebody explain that to me. How do you have someone who, by the very nature of the profession, if you want to call this a profession, if you say politics is a profession, how do you, by the sheer fact that they are involved in a profession where nothing is produced, how can they be the ones that are the engines that drive the society? How can they be the motors of society? And those of you who have read Ayn Rand's book, her novel, her great novel, Atlas Shrugged, you saw that in the novel that came out in 1957, where when she wrote this book, it was clear that Ayn Rand was writing a philosophy. Had not been identified as such at that time, but once that was published, it was very clear that the person in back of it was bringing something very different in terms of how her outlook about how society operates. And she called John Galt. Who is John Galt? She called John Galt the major character in her book, in her novel, she called him and others the molders of society, and the title Atlas Shrugged was just that. At some point, John Galt shrugged. He wasn't getting any of the accolades for the role he was playing, so he decided to withdraw. And so Atlas shrugged, and when Atlas shrugged, then the molders of society, by them withdrawing, were able to call attention to the fact that they were the ones, they were the engines that were moving society. So I just want to make it clear that this notion that we have that politicians have been the engines that have driven the societies forward and have not been the impediments to progress in societies is a misunderstanding of the history of societies and the history of politicians. They have not been the molders. They've been the impediments. And as I think more and more about it, I can now see what we mean by deep state. You know, we use this term deep state a lot, and you're hearing people say the deep state, they're running things. The deep state is running the society. They're the ones that's in the deep state are making the decisions for the country, and they are somehow above the government, and they are dictating the terms on which those we elect are in fact acting, not in our name, those are the names of the electorate, but they are operating in the name of those who are above them that are willing unseeming power that's not accrued to them because they don't have the numbers that we have here, and it's not our voice, but it's their voice because they are the money class, they are the corporate interests and all those types of things that if without them, if they did not exist, the idea is then they would be doing the bidding of the people, but they're kept from doing that because of these interests above the level of the government.
You know, see, if you ever see the movie, I tell people, go watch the movie The Last Emperor, about the last emperor of China as the communists took over. And the eunuchs were kicked out of the palace, and they were like, they're walking, and then they burned the records, because the record places and stuff, because there was accounts, and you know, there was like definitely going to be stuff, the books were not in the right order. They were stealing and pilfering for generations. And that's, I mean, that's what you're talking about. Because every time you got a congressman or senator that's voted in or out of office, you got people who have been there. Their families have been in there for generations doing the paperwork and they're part of that deep state. They don't want to see things change. They got a plum assignment. They probably show up twice a week for work. You know, they're not these dedicated, hardworking people. They are parasitic, and then politicians themselves are parasites. But
John, I was going to ask you, when you hear the word deep state, what do you think about?
That's what I think about it. I'm thinking about the bureaucrats that don't face public scrutiny. See, that's what I think. It's like, and then you got, like, you know, the FBI, all those alphabet soup things. Those people are the part of the deep state.
Yes.
They okay stuff. They don't jump on stuff. They fail. It's up to their discretion when stuff's reported or, you know, looked at or whatever, investigated. They choose not to because it helps out friends and family to do this or to do that or not to do this. So that's part of the deep state as well. It is a swamp. They are swamp creatures. They've been in it for generations. I mean, some of those probably go 4 generations deep.
It took me a while to understand the nature of the game that's being run on the American people, but it's a game being played all over the planet. And everywhere I have gone, I've been in 17 countries in Africa, and everywhere I've gone, I've seen the same thing that is operating underneath the radar. I can name a lot of different ways in which the game is played. The ultimate result of it is the same, where the politicians are in fact concealed in terms of the real role they're playing in the society as the parasites that they are. They're not molders of society, they're parasites. And the parasites have to have a host, and the host is always going to be those who are the taxpayers. And I was reminded of that yesterday when I went to my tax accountant and had my taxes done, and I knew I was going to owe something back. Not that I owe it, but you say you owe it. I didn't buy anything, and the government's not delivering anything that I purchased. Is that if I don't pay it, then they're going to send the blue envelope. And the blue envelope would be those persons coming to your door with guns.
But you know, it's like they always, all the liberals.
So I'm paying my taxes.
I remember the liberal once. I posted something a few years ago on Facebook about taxation, and they give me that little civics lesson. We pay for the streets and the roads. That's what you do in the schools. And I said, I mean, the guy was doing this. His family. I'm not going to use a name, but his family are like part of the political swamp locally, you know. And I said, well, thank you for the civics lesson, but let's face it, and I like the meme that's out there on Facebook, we don't pay taxes for government services. We pay government our taxes, so we can avoid going to jail.
That's
hopefully.
Exactly what you
That's
pay
all
taxes.
it's about.
If you don't pay them, they ask this question of Ayn Rand, if you believe in the things that you write about in your novels, then why do you pay taxes since you have no confidence in the state? And Ayn Rand's answer was, I pay taxes because if I don't pay taxes, they'll put me in jail.
We're the most unfree. I mean, I get this is my personal opinion. I don't know if you agree with it. You probably don't. But the flag wavers. Oh, we're America, land of the free. We are the least free. I mean, let's face it. We tax. Our government is one of the few people in the world that taxes people who are citizens of the United States but not currently living in the United States. You still have to pay them their share. So that's not slavery. What is?
Taxation is theft, and because you cannot avoid paying these persons, you have to pay them off. Otherwise, they will not leave you alone.
Different than the mafia. They really aren't no different than the guys in the mafia.
And that is exactly, this one book I brought, that's exactly what Thomas De Lorenzo is talking about in his book called Organized Crime. And I've talked about this book a number of times before on the air, and the subtitle of it is The Unvarnished Truth About Government. So when I say deep state, and I was asking the question earlier, what do you mean by deep state? It took me a while to actually figure this out. And the deep state is really the state itself that is disguised behind the masking that goes on to convince the people that it's not what it is by its own design. Inherently in the apparatus of the state is a parasitic apparatus that's in place, and it feeds upon the hosts, and the hosts are those that go to work, and because of you being under the duress and control of the persons that are extracting wealth from those who are producing wealth, they don't produce it themselves, then you're paying them for the privilege of being able to go out there and use the sweat of your brow to earn wealth, and then you have it extracted, so you pay them to leave you alone. And it's well disguised. They're very well disguised. And when I'm out on these programs, or at some programs where I'm going to maybe a community program, and people come up to me and they say, ask me if, what are you, a Republican? I'm offended by that. I'm offended by anybody that thinks that I would be affiliated with either one of these two parties. John, that is very offensive to me. See, I would be a Republican or a Democrat.
Well, I used to be, how do you say I'm more Republican? Because I had affinity for it because my dad's family were more Republicans. But when I look at it, let's face it, John McCain, I cannot say I'm a Republican, have the thought of John McCain being one of those and saying I'm proud to be there. I think the Republican Party has a lot less to be ashamed of than the Democratic Party. Because if you look at all the corrupt political families and dynasties and political machines in big cities like New York and Detroit, they're always run by Democrats. Okay, and the horrific stuff they did. Let's face it, it's a cesspool. I mean, it's not a swamp, it's a cesspool. It's totally human created. A swamp, at least you got wildlife living on the edges of it. You don't a cesspool. Nobody wants to be around it, and that's all. Cesspools and that family, that's all the Democrats. So the Democrats have far more to be ashamed of. But thing is, like a true sociopath, they never are. They never are ashamed of what they've done.
Your analysis is pretty close to what my analysis is. I think that anyone that is walking around underneath the political class in this country, the elite, that call themselves in the name of those that are running the society and call them by the names that they have been really assigned by the political elite, and they call themselves Democrats or Republicans, those persons are insane. Certainly they're brainwashed. And I think, and that's why I was trying to say on this program that we've not had a civil war, and we have not had a war over slavery. The politicians would have it that Abraham Lincoln, who was so undone by having slavery in the society of which he had become president in 1860, would engage the country in a war in which between 600,000 and 700,000 persons would have been thrown up against each other simply because of the immorality of slavery existing on the soil of the United States, which was going on, by the way, everywhere else in the world, as if it was something unusual to have slavery in a country when all countries were, before the 19th century, practicing slavery. And you can't name one, whether you're talking about Africa, Asia, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Latin America. It didn't matter. It doesn't matter which place you go. Slavery was a universal institution, and the idea that this Republican president had run on some campaign that if he were in fact elected, he was going to change the landscape, the political landscape and social landscape of the country and liberate the slaves. This may well read well in these history books, but in terms of the documentation, it's quite a different story here. But I see how they're using Abraham Lincoln. They're using Abraham Lincoln to draw people to this idea that politicians basically are benevolent, and they have the good intent. They have good intentions, and the intent is to do the greatest good for the greatest number. And if left alone, if they weren't being interfered with by these vultures, the ones who are the producers, I kept hearing the corporate interests and things of that sort, they're running it, and if they didn't bring a fistful of dollars through their lobbying agents, then the politicians would do the right thing by the American people, because basically these are virtuous people who pursue power. And I used to think that that was true until I began to look at how this thing is played. And of course, reading the non-traditional writers, I'm reading a lot of De Lorenzo's works. I think his book, Organized Crime, should be required reading. The Unvarnished Truth About Government. But there are other writers also. And there's a book I brought to the studio as well, the one called The Great Tax Wars. Lincoln to Wilson, this is the subtitle, Lincoln to Wilson, the fierce battles over money and power that transformed the nation. And this is Stephen Wiseman's book. And you can read other works by Charles Adams, has some good works out. You can read the book written by Schweizer's book, the Architects of Ruin, meaning the politicians, or throw them all out, one of his books, which is the fact that behind the masking that is taking place, we have these vulturistic politicians, and that's what they are. And it doesn't matter what party they're in. They're vultures, whether in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. When they say that you're either this party or that party, I think everybody that is identified as being either this party or the other party, they're being insulted by it, because an intelligent person would not affiliate with the elite class, because they're not for the Democrats, those who are in the Democratic Party, or those in the Republican Party. What they are about is the accumulation of power. And that's what this whole thing is about. I saw them out there just the other day at this demonstration, and it's shameful. Children in high school that should be in school learning the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and learning how to be competitive in a more competitive market and developing their skills, that means they've got to get busy, because they're not having these demonstrations with children in these other countries they're going to have to compete against. And as society becomes more technical, becoming more technological, they're going to need greater and greater skills. And here they are out here, got these children up here at the microphone, half of them didn't know what they were talking about. And they're talking about the Florida shooting, 17 persons being killed, and they're looking at this as a gun issue. And nobody's talking about the fact that they have these police officers who are acting inappropriate, and that this person that went off like that had been identified on a number of occasions as someone who was a threat to those around him. And the person was tweeting, by the way, and saying that he wanted to be identified as going off in some school. And he had been reported to local police, he'd been reported to the FBI, and what they did with that information has not come to the forum and to the forefront because they're too busy talking about what the politicians want to talk about, because they don't want to let any crisis go to waste. And in this case here, they're using this as a gun issue. Yeah, use a gun, but the gun didn't use itself. Somebody was behind the gun. And I would like to see if this person was like so many of the others that have gone off with these guns. Was this person on some kind of meds? Because a lot of this is pharmacological. The pharmaceutical industry, they're medicating. There are 52 million children in schools in this country, and 12 million of them are medicated, meaning that they are putting them on these drugs in order to induce a certain behavior in the schools where the children can sit down rather than giving them gym class, which is what they did when I was in school. You simply let them run the energy off in the gym class. And that's more needed now than it was when I was in school, because the children can't go out and play like they did when I was coming up. You know, we used to go around, you know, kicking a can around the community, you know, making up some exercise. And we were always doing something physical. The season would change. Okay, it's now summer, we're playing baseball. Then the fall comes in, we're playing some other sport. Then the winter comes in, we're playing football. And you're around, you're outside. They can't go outside now, it's too dangerous. And then they get them in the classroom, they're sitting down and they're bouncing off the walls. They think this is a Ritalin problem. And they give them these drugs and they medicate them so that when they come off those drugs and come down from those drugs, those children do not have any skills to negotiate themselves, to navigate through crises and through problems. And they get frustrated and don't know how to handle the frustration. Then, before you know it, we have some incidents that's coming about in school. Why are these children shooting in these schools? Why is that going on? And don't be blaming the guns, because they used to bring guns to school and put them in their locker and would have target practice in their gym class, and they had to put the gun up, the rifle up in the locker until the gym class was meeting, and then they take the gun out of the locker, take it to the gym class. Gym class is over, take it back to their locker, and then take it home after school's over. It's not the guns. It's what else we are doing that we don't want to look at. And of course they want to grab the guns, because one of the things politicians want, they want to have the unique and only use of force. Of course they have the other ones that have the legal right to use force, to initiate force, but they want to be the only ones that's able to have the firepower which force represents. And if people are if the Second Amendment is not in fact curtailed, then the politicians will be the ones that's in charge. And they are in charge to the point where the people cannot respond to anything they do that's outside of the orbit of their power based upon the constitutional restrictions that's placed upon them. And that's just a problem we're going to have if we let them get our guns. And everything now is a gun issue. They're now talking about how they're going to pass legislation to restrict that. But the deep state, let's come back to that point I was trying to make about the deep state. The deep state is not somebody above the people that's in Washington. The deep state are those politicians who are masked as to who they really represent. These people are monsters behind their mask. And it doesn't matter what party label they use. Both parties have gotten this country in the shape that it's in right now. Can you tell me why we have a $20 trillion debt, which has been passed on to a generation that's not even here yet, that they have disenfranchised the voters that are yet to be born in this country, that when they come into the world, they'll come into the world with a debt already assessed against them, and they have already been taxed by these politicians, if you want to call them politicians. These people are masked, and they are taxing people who are yet to even be born yet at this point. So that when you talk about a $20 trillion debt, that means then that the taxation, okay, we're going to take a break at this point. At WFOV, we will now take a 4-minute break, and we will see you in 4 minutes on the other side of the break, and we will then continue at that point. With allpointstv.com, of course, we will continue what we're doing here, and we'll continue to go down the path we're going down as far as talking about these criminal and crooked politicians, because that's the deep state. The deep state really is the political class, those who wielding power, who have concealed their identity behind the masking, the smiles, and so on and so forth. You know, you saw an example of that, by the way, in Pennsylvania this past Tuesday. They had this election where this one person that was running in a district that was won by Donald Trump in 2016, Donald Trump took this district by 20%. So what did the Democrat do, the one running in the Democratic Party, do in that district? He ran as a Republican. I don't mean he changed the party label. I'm saying that he picked up the banner of the Republican Party and he used it in the Democratic Party, and he was running on the same formula that Donald Trump had run on. He's against gun control. He is not going to endorse Nancy Pelosi if they take the majority in the House in 2018, the midterm election. If you look at his agenda, he ran on the Republican Party agenda, concealing himself behind the mask. These people are masking in front of the American people, and they fell for it.
Well, the years ago, the Democrats that I knew, and as many as I did never like the Democratic Party, but I mean, because the national level of leadership was always on the left. But here locally, if you look at, we had a lot of them who were considered almost like Dixiecrats. But the Democratic Party has been transformed since the 60s. I mean, it has gotten solidly more left, more bizarre in their demands, in my opinion. And so, but I mean, there are some people out there who are, like Kucinich. Dennis Kucinich was actually more of a constitutionalist. Even though he was a Democrat, he was more of a constitutionalist. So there are those type of animals out there,
That party now is I think they're the party of treason, quite frankly. John, I think what we're saying here, really both parties are doing it, but the Democratic Party, this party now has been pushed so far to the left that you might as well put this party in Moscow. And we see them investigating Trump for collusion with the Russians. Nothing could be further from the truth. The left has never been against Russia. And this investigation, and you don't see anybody doing an investigation of anybody on the left, like Hillary Clinton, for example. That party, the party this is basically a communist party on the national level, and they're for big government, and they're for more and more power accruing to the federal government. And until we get off this train, I was saying on this radio show that if we don't get back into the view of the framers, we don't return back to our roots, then this country is doomed. And you can take that or let that alone. But if we don't get back to where we are, our beginning points, our roots, then this is not going to go well. It's not going to turn out well. Okay, they're back from WFOV. We're glad to have you back. And we are still talking about these politicians. And if you believe that these politicians have your back and have the best interests of this country at heart, then you are in a zone of thinking that you've been trained into, because they make sure that they surround you with their propaganda. First of all, in the school systems, and all around you is their propaganda. They use Abraham Lincoln to drive this narrative that government has been a benevolent institution. They have to deal with Abraham Lincoln, because Abraham Lincoln led Abraham Lincoln, quite frankly, his policies led to the slaughter of between 600,000 and 700,000 people. They have to have some benevolent reason why that would go on. And they're saying that it was a war to end slavery. And that's what Lincoln was trying to do. He wanted to free the slaves, and this war was over slavery. And when I come behind these apologists or politicians and say that's not true, then you're making a fool of yourself, George, by making those kinds of statements. Okay, fine. I brought Abraham Lincoln's inaugural speech to the studio.
This is his first inauguration?
His first inaugural speech, given on Monday, March 4th, 1861. I have it right here. And I want to read you some of the comments that Abraham Lincoln made. And you tell me what is in his inaugural speech on March the 4th of 1861, what is in his speech that remotely indicates this man intends to free anybody from slavery. The introduction to it, and here's the introductory remark to it. The national upheaval of secession was a grim reality at Abraham Lincoln's inauguration. Let me read that again. The national upheaval of secession was a grim reality at Abraham Lincoln's inauguration. Jefferson Davis, who, as you know, was the president of the Confederate States, had been inaugurated as the president of the Confederacy 2 weeks earlier. The former Illinois congressman had arrived in Washington by a secret route to avoid danger, and his movements were guarded by General Winfield Scott soldiers when he arrived. Ignoring advice to the contrary, the president-elect rode with President Buchanan in an open carriage to the Capitol, where he took the oath of office on the East Portico. Chief Justice Roger Taney administered the executive oath for the 7th time. The Capitol itself was sheathed in scaffolding because the copper and wood, quote, bullfinch, unquote, dome was being replaced with a cast iron dome designed by Thomas Walter. That's the environment in which Lincoln took the inaugural oath. But let's go to some of the comments he made. I want to read to you the opening paragraphs of Abraham Lincoln's speech. He says in the second paragraph, apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Now, the first part of that he has no lawful right to do so, is admirable in terms of the constitutional mandates that are in place. That's not about Abraham Lincoln. That's about the Constitution and the fact that slavery is recognized in the dogma of the country. But the part that does have something to do with Abraham Lincoln is the second part of that statement, where he says that I have no inclination to do anything about slavery. Those who nominated and elected me, this is Lincoln speaking, did so with full knowledge that had made this and many similar declarations, and had never recanted them. In other words, speech after speech after speech that Lincoln had made indicated he had no inclination to do anything about slavery, and he had never recanted those statements. And more than this is Lincoln speaking again, and more than this, they placed in the platform of my acceptance, and as a law to themselves and to me, the clear and emphatic resolution which I now read. This is Lincoln reading it. Resolved, that the maintenance invalid of the rights of the states, and especially the right of each state to order and control its own domestic institutions according to his own judgment exclusively, is essential to that balance of power on which the perfection and endurance of our political fabric depend. And we denounce the lawless invasion, listen carefully to this part, and we denounce the lawless invasion by armed force of the soil of any state or territory, no matter what pretext, as among the gravest of crimes. I now reiterate these sentiments, and in doing so, I only press upon the public attention the most conclusive evidence of which the case is susceptible, that the property, peace, and security of no section are to be in any wise endangered by the now incumbent administration. I add, too, that all the protection which consistently with the Constitution and the laws can be given will be cheerfully given to all the states when lawfully demanded for whatever cause, as cheerfully to one section as to another. So with that being said, and with the secession in full bloom, then what is the South then and the North fighting over? They're not fighting over slavery, because Lincoln has said that he has no inclination, and the law does not allow him, these are his words, and not my words, I'm reading his speech. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no legal right to do so. In other words, slavery is not threatened in the Union. Why? Because slavery is in fact recognized in the Constitution. But Lincoln also says above that, he has no inclination to interfere with slavery. So what is this war really about then? Because it's not a war over slavery. Well, Stephen Weisman's book, The Great Tax Wars, is the name of his book. And the book is From Lincoln to Wilson. This is the subtitle of the book. Lincoln to Wilson, the fierce battles over money and power that transformed the nation. This is a war over taxation. And we just now passed, this is what the present president, Trump, passed a tariff on aluminum and steel. And this is what was the problem in terms of the tariff that was passed in 1832, called the Tariff of Abomination. There was another tariff in 1828. This was a tariff that almost drove South Carolina to secede from the Union in that year. And in 1832, they did threaten to secede from the Union because of the tariff policy. In other words, they were standing up against the taxation in 1828 and 1832 that their forefathers had stood up against in 1776. The fight is the same fight. The taxation wars that Weisman is writing about, from Lincoln to Wilson, we've been battling the government ever since this government was established over taxation. And before this government was established, we were fighting King George III over taxation. This country was actually founded in an objection to taxation. Not taxation without, because we're not represented. They were fighting a battle because of taxation, period. Because taxation was looked at as being, taxation was viewed as theft, and that's what taxation is. My tax accountant yesterday was she was so distraught because she couldn't get. I was paying a very large tax bill, and she thought she had not done her job. And that's not, I told her, don't worry about it. I will write the check. But the reason why my tax bill is so high is because I do not allow them to take any money out ahead of time, because I don't want to give these thieves any of my money until they compel me to do so at gunpoint. I will not voluntarily give the money until the money is in fact demanded under duress and by the power of the state. So on the 15th, I will in fact write a check. And it's not a small check. But I don't pay them up front. I want them to know that I am protesting what they do, because I know who they are behind their mask. They are the deep state. The government is a deep state. But the deep state is masked, and it looks like somebody is wielding power above them, because the idea in front of that they put in front of the public is that they are basically virtuous, and if not being impacted upon by the outsiders, they would in fact do the people's will, but they can't do it because they are tethered through the vested interests in the country that in fact imposing their will upon these officials. But the deep state is not that. The deep state are these politicians who are in fact imbued with power. In fact, let me just say it this way. The difference between the politicians here and the politicians in North Korea is that we elect our dictators, where in the North Korean in North Korea, the politicians there will power by the show of the guns, and the guns are not hidden. Here the guns are hidden. But they will power in both places, just that here we elect the ones who are the dictators. These people are dictators. But they will power in a way in which it does not seem like the people's voice has been taken from them. But the people don't have any voice in this country. The government in Washington does what it wants to do. And this idea they had of giving a tax break, they put the tax break was, there's no tax break in this country because there was no reduction in spending. If you want to give people a tax break, what you have to first of all do is reduce the spending, and then the surplus you have, because the spending has been reduced, the surplus you have, you then give a tax break down to the surplus, so as to get rid of the surplus, because you have this much money that you don't need, because your tax is no longer necessary to that level, because you reduce the cost of government, and therefore you reduce the cost of government, therefore you can give people their money back, because there's no longer need to pay for the cost of government. You didn't see that happening. So what happened to the taxation was that they put the taxes in the future, and people thought it was a tax reduction. The government needs to reduce its size. And if it reduces its size, then it reduces its influence. If it reduces influence, it reduces its power, and they're not going to give any power back. Government is a power-engorging institution, and it is a liberty-grabbing institution. That's what Delarenz is talking about, the unvarnished truth about government and organized crime. These people are organized gangsters. And if anybody thinks that they are going to do anything better than that based upon one party to another, the reason why the midterm probably will be flipped is because the American people keep going back from one party to another looking for a way out. And when the Republican Party is voted in during the midterm, they vote that power's numbers down, and they go to the other party, and they got us going back and forth. We don't realize we're going from one slave master to another, and both parties are in fact enslavers of the American people, because the American people don't have representation in either party. That's why I'm insulted when somebody tell me that they think I'm a Republican, and that happens all the time, because I criticize a party that's in power, and I did it when Obama was in power, and they thought because that you're not supposed to criticize as a black person a black the president, the so-called first black president, when you criticize him as just another political imposter, they think that that you can. How do you do that? And I did it because he is no different from any of the others that have been in that office. In fact, Obama was passing for black. He was a white president passing as a black president. And if you say that's not true, then you tell me how is he a black president when his father was never an American citizen? And if he had been a black president, which he wasn't, I would have criticized him because his policies were bad for black people. And black people are wasting their time appealing to the when they were in the Republican Party, and they're wasting time now as part of the Democratic Party. Let me read something to you. If I'm wrong in this, let me read something to you about what King said. This is written. This is the speech that Dr. King gave in 1957, because King was aware. Finally, I mean, King was very much aware of the nature of the problem he was facing in the South. King gave a speech on the 17th of May, 1957, on the 3rd anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education case. And in the speech, which has been titled, "Give Us the Ballot," King said on 6 different occasions in that speech, "Give us the ballot." The first time he said it, he said these words. He said, "Give us the ballot, and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights." Why would King say that? Why would King say, "Give us the ballot, and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our rights, our basic rights, the right to vote, the right to quality schools"? Why would the vote be of some significance to gain the right to vote and protect what King calls their basic rights? It's because the ones that were the impediment to those rights were the politicians in the South. And the politicians in the South that were standing in the way of those basic rights were Democrats. It's one of the biggest political scams in history that the Democrats would then push their baggage off on all whites in the country and make it a problem of racism, so that it's no longer a problem over the voting process, and the political class is now white people, quote unquote. So now racism is the issue in society, not the Democratic Party's largest in terms of what they were doing to keep blacks away from the polls. Why? Because when the so-called Civil War came to a close, black people were not going to vote for the party of their slave masters, which would have been the Democratic Party. So given the fact that blacks were basically in the South, the Democratic Party disenfranchised blacks after Reconstruction because they knew that if blacks were allowed to vote, they would in fact vote for the Republican Party. So there was a denial of the right to vote. King is talking in 57 of gaining the right to vote because he recognized that the person sitting over the basic rights of blacks was the Democratic Party. And in a very interesting way of shifting the blame for the disenfranchisement, it stopped being the political class that was a problem, and they were shifted off and made into a problem of racism rather than a problem of the Democratic Party having gained its power base by the disenfranchisement of blacks in the southern part of the United States. And it wasn't until Woodrow Wilson who nationalized the disenfranchisement of blacks. When Wilson was president in 1912, he was elected in 1912. When Wilson took office in 1913, he began to nationalize the disenfranchisement of blacks in the country. And that disenfranchisement will last until blacks voted their pocketbook under Roosevelt. And now blacks are beginning to move into the Democratic Party in 1932 on the New Deal, and that trickling of blacks out of the Republican Party, not that that was any big deal. The Republican Party had sold them down the drain also, and it did so in 1876 with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in that year. The Republican Party used blacks during the Reconstruction period, and then it would no longer behoove them to use blacks in order to maintain power. Then after Ulysses S. Grant had been in power for 8 years, in order for the Republican Party to maintain power, then Rutherford B. Hayes, in order to maintain Republican power, Rutherford B. Hayes made a deal with the southern states, and he then came in under a deal that was made in 1876, and those votes that were being questioned in Louisiana, in Florida, and in Kentucky, those 20 electoral votes that were up for grabs, he made a deal with the South, and those votes went to the Republican Party, and the Republican Party threw blacks under the bus. And then when it behooved the Democratic Party to throw blacks under the bus, they did so. I'm just saying that neither party has been a friend to blacks, and that's not going to change. But they're not the friends of whites either. The divide and conquer scheme that's used by these parties keep both groups divided, so both parties can rule, and both parties rule together. It's a scam that's going on. If the people were clear about anything that's really going on right in front of their face by these two political parties, they would in fact come together. Blacks and whites would come together against the political elite in this country. We have a class interest, and the only class interest that is being carried out in this country right now is a political class interest. The political elite run this country, and they run it against both whites in this country and blacks in this country. And racism is a smokescreen to keep people at each other's throats, keep them fighting among themselves. Neither party is for anything but the grabbing of power, and they share it back and forth, whether it's Republican or Democrat. They share power together. And if that's not true, I just want you to look at what they just did recently. The Republican Party came out last week and said that it did not have any finding of any collusion between the Donald Trump administration and the Russians. Well, we knew that. There was no new revelation about the collusion. The collusion was the Democratic Party colluding with Russia. And Russia was colluding with the Democrats because they thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidency. And they were not colluding to get her elected. They thought she was going to be elected. They were buying influence once that had been carried out through the voting process. They weren't interfering with the election. They were trying to get some insurance so when the election was over, they would have their candidate in power and would have some influence what they do once they get in power in the nation's capital. That's why they were paying the money to the Clinton Foundation, and why they were in fact raising the amount of money that was being paid to the speeches of Bill Clinton. They were buying influence for the future, but she didn't win. And when they did win, when Trump won and Hillary Clinton lost, the narrative became that the collusion was Donald Trump colluding with the Russians, which was not. Why would the Russians collude with Donald Trump when they knew based upon the polls, everybody knew that the man had no shot. Everybody knew that except his voters. And a lot of the other voters were lulled to sleep. They didn't come to the polls thinking it was a done deal, and that's how he got through there. So Donald Trump won by the media running a narrative that backfired on him. And Hillary Clinton then campaigned in several of the key states, those states being Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And the 46 electoral votes they had there pulled him over the top. If he had not gotten those votes, he would have had 269, and you needed 270. The point I'm trying to make here is that last week you saw where the House came out and said they had no findings that there was anything going on in terms of collusion between the Republican administration, so-called Republican administration, and the Russians. But did they then say to Mueller, you must shut your investigation down? No, they talked out of both sides of their mouth. They didn't find anything wrong, but they let the investigation go forward. Because the Republican Party does not want Donald Trump in there either. Because both parties want the playing field out of the hands of the American people. And at least Donald Trump has a tie-in to the American people because neither party supports him. And that's our Trump card right now. We have to understand the politics of this country, and we have got to get back to the founders if we're going to save the United States of America. If we don't get back to the founders and the founding ideas of this country is lost. It's as simple as that. Okay, we got to get out of here again. I want to thank you for staying tuned for the last hour. Don't forget to follow your dreams, because if you don't follow your dreams, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.